Hey everyone, Mr. Feather here. We recently wrapped up a drawing that we call a schematic portrait, just where we did a generic, generalized face and did some basic proportions, eyes halfway down, nose the width of the inside of the two eyes, etc. And using those proportions, the knowledge of it, and generally how to shade, we're going to take our drawing to the next level by actually drawing from observation your self-portrait from a mirror. So as you can see, I have a mirror set up here. I have a 9x12 drawing pad, or just a piece of paper. When you draw from a mirror, there are a couple things you want to think about. If you don't have a mirror in front of you at your desk, you have to get one and bring it to your desk, or you have to bring your desk to a mirror. But you want a good setup where it's comfortable to sit, because you're probably going to be sitting drawing yourself from that mirror for 2 to 3 hours in order to finish a good drawing. And secondly, you want to make sure your lighting is consistent, because if you're right next to a window, right now it's like 8 p.m. I'm near a window, but it's not going to impact my drawing at all because the light's not going to change. Whereas if I started at like 4:30, by the time it got to 7 p.m., all of the window light's going to diminish and the shading situation of my face is going to completely change. I also have different lamps set up so that I have a stronger light source and a stronger shadow source, just so the drawing's more interesting. Once I'm all set up, I'm going to take my pencil, and I'm going to think about composition. How can I do this drawing so my head fills the space pretty well? And so I'm going to draw really light finding lines. I'm going to be looking directly in the mirror as I do this and glance down at my paper occasionally. The mistake that beginning drawers make is that they look a lot at their paper because they think they know what they look like, and they stop looking at the subject very often. And the ideal really is probably 90% of the time looking at your subject in the mirror, and 10% of the time sort of glancing down at your paper to make sure what you want to happen is happening. It seems like I'm scribbling. I'm doing a lot of light finding lines to figure out what needs to go where without really committing, because if I commit with hard lines right now, I'm probably going to get a proportion wrong somewhere, and I'm going to be hesitant to change it because it'll be so hard, sort of drawn into the paper, and I want to be able to move stuff around. So as you can see, I did find that middle line, and I'm sort of thinking about how to space things out. My head's going to be slightly turned, so towards this side, just because of the way I'm sitting, and that's okay. You can do an exact direct frontal drawing like we did before, or you can slightly turn your head a little bit. There are also lines that I draw finding lines that I draw in order to get things to look right, that maybe we wouldn't think of as being there, but I've got a pretty sharp like shadow line coming down this spot and a sharp line kind of coming down here. And if I draw those, that's going to help me make sure I have enough space, because there are shapes on my face that aren't the traditional shapes that you would see or think of seeing, but they're definitely going to help you draw accurately. This drawing isn't one that you want to do along with me, because I'm not telling you what to do when. It's just one that you're going to want to kind of see how I set it up, and so that when you set yours up and go through the different steps, that you have a pretty good handle on how to do it. And all these finding lines I'm making a little darker than I would if I wasn't doing it as a demo, because I want to make sure you can see them well on the camera here. And a lot of these are going to go away later. Like, I'm going to make some lines and feel like, hey, I didn't like that as much as I thought I would. And I'm going to need to make some adjustments here as I'm checking things out, checking out my proportions. Another thing to keep in mind is that I've got a camera behind me showing me in the mirror, but that camera is a slightly different angle from what my eye sees in the mirror. So what you're seeing me draw and the reflection that you're seeing is going to be at a slightly different angle, just because I cannot put the camera right in the middle of my face for you, so you're not going to see exactly what I'm seeing. But it should give you a pretty good indication of how I'm approaching the drawing. You might also notice that I'm not holding my pencil the way I would if I was writing something, where I really need the line to be hard and controlled. I'm holding it sort of in a looser grip where I've backed off on the pencil, and that will prevent me from pressing too hard or fussing over control. It just kind of liberates me into just this sort of finding sketching. Alright, made a pause there. Did a little bit of extra sketching and had a little conversation, side conversation. Second reason I'm starting this drawing later is because my kids are in bed, and it's a lot easier to focus on something when no one's going to bother you. So doing it at a time where no one's going to ask anything of you is really quite nice. I'm going to go ahead and, before we start to get into making your lines harder and putting in shadows, you really want to make sure your proportion seems right and shift some things around if you need to. At this point, everything should be pretty easy to erase or change. And I usually don't go real heavy right away. What I'll do is kind of find some areas that I know are going to be in shadow and just slightly start mapping those shadow areas. Because when you're only dealing with line, a lot of times things seem too wide or too flat, and then once you put the shadows in, things start to round out. I don't think I mentioned yet, but feel free as you're watching this video to change the speed of the video to ×2 if you're just watching it for information and you can understand what I'm saying and watch my hand move and it's easy enough for you, you can totally change the speed of the drawing. I want to remind you that as you're drawing shapes like the iris and the pupil, you're not just drawing two circles, you're drawing a triangle that's white in here for the sclera, the white of the eye, and then another triangle that's going to be out here. And if those shapes don't match the shapes that you see, your eye's going to look weird. That's really kind of the magic of making sure your eye looks real, is not just getting the iris and pupil looking right, but the whole proportion of the eye depends on the shapes of the whites. my highlight in this instance is actually rather small, but sometimes I will take a shape like a highlight that's kind of important in a drawing and make it bigger than what I actually can see. I kind of put it in the same spot, but I'll enhance it a little bit because I want that high contrast area to be there. My wife had asked me why it looks so serious. There's a funny thing that happens when we take photos. We have this expectation that we're supposed to smile. Portrait photos. Everyone say cheese. Everyone smiles. But when you're just observing people normally, people aren't smiling like that. They might not be scowling or mad or anything, but like you don't just hang out like smiling all the time usually. And when you're doing a self-portrait, you're really doing a long time of just sort of a task. You're observing yourself. And it's really awkward actually to do a self-portrait and keep looking in the mirror and like smiling big at yourself. So you just sort of your general serious gaze typically shows up in your drawing. And a little bit of whatever mood you're in at the time. So I'm shading into the white of the eye to give it the roundness. That's a really important step. I definitely have shadow on that section. And I'm thinking about what sections around the eye are light. Like I've got a highlight hitting me there and a highlight hitting me out here that I'll kind of put back in. And then there's that waterline edge that's going to be quite bright too. So I'm going to leave that before I go under. There are so many different gray values in your skin. You're going to have fairly dark shadows. Like I've got a pretty dark shadow in this area right there. But then there's so many medium and light values and transitions, and you really want to look hard. The key to a really great portrait drawing is not just getting the proportions right and getting general shadows in the right place, but it's getting all those little subtleties in what's happening in the skin. Got a little bit of hair sticking out right there down my sideburn there. And that actually will help to make the edge of my face really stand out. And shade a little bit over where my eyebrow is before I put in the actual texture, so that if there's space between the textures, it's still going to have that grayishness to it. Different artists have different patterns as to how they'll approach a drawing like this. Typically, you always want to put out your composition layout lightly. You need to know where everything is. Otherwise, you're going to end up drawing. If you start with the eye and then work your way out, you're going to find that you're running the top of your head right off the paper, and I'm sure you've all experienced doing a drawing like that, where something you like smush it to make it fit. It's way better to get everything composed correctly before you start with any details. But some artists will focus on one area and work their way out, and other artists will generally like map out like, okay, I know I've got shadows here and I've got shadows here, and they'll work out really loose sections of light and shadow first and then start refining. Either approach is fine. There's not a right or wrong or better or worse way. But you should experiment and see what feels like it works for you better. There are also different shading techniques where, like, having the mark making show can be fine. Other people really like to go so soft that you can't see the marks. If you're going to use mark making that shows as you lay down edges, you really want to make the lines make sense to the texture and the direction of what you're dealing with. You don't want them to go, like, for instance, easy example, you'd want to be drawing hair lines against the hair. You want to draw them with the hair. But in the skin, it's a little bit less obvious which direction you need to make those texture lines. But you really want to be thoughtful about it. You don't just want to be random. Because I often will make a lot of different directions as I go. And it matters. It will sort of dictate the sense of volume you're creating. I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to pause the video and develop the shading a little more, and then return to do a little more drawing. Made a little progress. I wanted to bring you back to show you a little bit more of the nose work, because a lot of people simplified the nose too much in terms of the light and shadow, and when we did the schematic, we had sort of a light cheek, dark stripe, light center, dark, light, dark again. But there's actually a lot more. Like there's a darker stripe and then a lighter shadow area that comes down here, and then another darker shadow area that comes down here, at least in the lighting situation that I've got going on right now. And there's sort of a very light situation here, and then a dark here. This isn't going to be like totally bright white, but it's going to be pretty light here. And there are a couple of ways I can handle that. One is to like smudge it a little bit and then pull what seems like a highlight back into the drawing with your eraser. When I'm doing a drawing like this, I definitely use my pencil more than my eraser, but my eraser is just as important. talked about the nose sort of having a ball at the end. You really want to pay attention to what that shadow is doing. There are some spots where that nose is casting a shadow down onto my upper lip area, but not real far. There are spots of pretty high contrast where there's a fairly dark spot next to a fairly light spot. And make sure to preserve those. There's a little bit of a backlighting highlight hitting the side of my nose right there. Now, in case you're wondering, I've been using a 4B pencil, which is a sort of soft-ish shading pencil for this entire drawing. Some artists really get into switching pencils, like they'll do their preliminary drawing with an H pencil to make sure the lines are really light. I don't find that to be that necessary for me. Other artists really like to use the H pencils for the really light shading of the skin sections, and I actually think that can look way better, way smoother, way more real than the way I draw when I just use a softer shading pencil. But it takes longer. It takes a lot more layers of development. And so it kind of depends on the result you want. And as a beginning artist, you want to experiment with what is it that works best for you. So do a little of everything. Some artists do more with the blending stump, or like you see me use my finger occasionally. Some artists do no blending with a tool except for what their pencil will do. That's again a stylistic choice that you can kind of experiment with and see what you like more. Much lighter on that side. Significantly lighter. I think I'm ready to move down to the lip area. So when I started, I was really sketchy and loose. This is the point where I'm like, okay, where does the real line need to be? I drew a whole bunch of like sketchy lines, but one of these is going to be the real line. And so I really look at my face, and I really look at my drawing, and I find where it needs to be at that point. I already know basically, because I found a real close shape with a lot of these lines. But this is your time to get it just right. You can also really get into the texture of the lip. Like there are these lines that kind of come through. They're gentle, but when I shade, I usually kind of use those lines as the direction of the shading. upper lip is casting a shadow across my lower lip. And it gets a lot lighter, like that's where the light is really hitting my lip. A little bit of erasing there on the lightest part after I smudge it. And just a reminder, we don't want an outline around your lips. We want them to look like just value transitions. Sometimes that's going to be a darker lip next to lighter skin, and other times it's going to be a highlighted lip next to darker skin. There's definitely some complexities happening in the shapes there and the shadows there that you're going to want to get the shadow shapes right to get the volume to look accurate. Now in my case, I've got some stubble going on, and so the texture that I created, I can actually sort of stubble into where the stubble is happening if I'm careful. But I want to really be cognizant of the value, because some hairs are going to catch so much light they're going to look blonde or lighter than everything around them, and other hairs are going to just look darker. And you can see that, I think, in this first eyebrow that I shaded. The light is totally hitting the hairs of my eyebrow right along that top band, and the shadow is the most extreme here under the bottom part. And so actually the hairs look like they're blonde if you leave it white in there, or if you've got a pointy enough eraser, you can go in and erase skinny enough lines that look like hair. And there are erasers that are super skinny, like pen erasers, that artists will use for really thin sort of textural white lines. Some artists will take a bigger eraser and a razor blade and shave it so it's got this like really thin, like knife-like edge that they can do it that way too. Or you don't need to erase if you just leave the white of the paper there and just make your dark lines around it. All of those ways can work. And here's an example where the skin under the lip is darker than the lip itself. It's kind of creating a divot there for me. I'm going to pause again, do a little more drawing, and then join again. Alright, back in business. What I want you to notice here is how this half looks rounded and basically realistic. But when you look at this half, things look really flat and you're not really quite sure what's going to happen yet. And so, like I said, when you start your drawing, it's going to feel flat. You want to make sure everything's in relation to everything else, and don't be afraid to use those sort of finding lines of where is there a sort of a shadow or a cheekbone or an eyebrow angle or a hair edge. Anything that you can see that's a shape, that you can put in there is going to help you get your proportions right before you start committing to the shadow. And the shadow will just make it that much better. As long as everything's in the right place, everything should start to round out and have volume. You may have noticed, but I did a little bit of shifting. As I started shading into this eye socket, I realized the eye needed to move just a little bit. And that's why you start with those really light lines and you go darker only once you're super confident that it's in the right place. Just a reminder, the iris is darker on the outside and lighter towards the center. So I'll often only do pencil application along the outsides, and then sort of, you can either smudge into the center or like go real light in there. And then of course there's sort of a halo around the outside. It's extra dark. The white of the eye being a sphere or a ball, we need to shade it. Usually darker at the corners, but if you've got a strong light source coming from a corner, you might find that one side is darker than the other, just wholesale. So I dug out my pen eraser just to show you what these look like and how you can get into something pretty skinny to pull out the light. Another thing I added in while I was on pause is I found the edge of my shirt collar and how it interacts with the bottom of the drawing here. And I don't want to skimp on any area of the drawing. I definitely, in a portrait, definitely the focal point is the eyes, almost always. So that's going to have the highest contrast and the most development. But you don't want to underdevelop anything either. And so when you're looking at the shirt, you're actually going to see a lot of information, light and shadow, just as much variation in wrinkles as on the skin. Don't do a beautiful job on the skin and then like just make the shirt look flat. You want the shirt to look volumetric as well. In in-person classes, I pretty much never develop demo drawings very long. I try to just get the idea, give everyone the idea, and then let everyone start. I'm enjoying doing it this way, and it definitely has the advantage that you don't have to sit through this whole drawing of mine before you start. You can kind of get the idea and then get yourself started, and then watch a little more later. If you want to, watch it faster, pause it sometimes if you need. You have total control over how much time you spend with this video and how. Just a reminder, we've got that waterline below the eye before the eyelashes start. And I did the eyelashes over here when I was on pause, so I'm going to do them so you can see them this time. But first I want to make sure I've got that wrinkle defined and as dark as those shadows need to be. Okay, I think I'm ready. So, like I said, step one is just to make that line a little bit heavier. Step two is to look for the direction those eyelashes are coming out, which is sort of in the middle, sort of this curve, but then real short lines forward. And then they start to come out towards the outside. But you don't want to be too heavy on them. And then the bottom ones, we skip the water line, and these are really quite short strokes, pretty sparse. They're there, but they're not the first thing you notice. Sometimes the problem with graphite is that it's reflective or shiny, and if you like wiggle your own drawing, you'll see when it picks up the shine, which for me is somewhere in there. There you go. You can see that. What you don't want when you're photographing your drawing at the end, you don't want the photo to catch the shine. And the shines are going to happen mostly where it's really black, like in the pupils. It's not going to really shine where the graphite is applied fairly lightly. But just kind of be aware of that when you're photographing your drawing. You want to tip it to avoid shine. Like you can do a vertical camera shot so that there's not a direct light source bouncing right off of the shine. You also don't want like your hand shadow like in front of your drawing when you're taking a photo either. You really want to be thoughtful about the lighting situation. And one other thing I want to talk to you about is the idea of parallax. What parallax is if you're looking at a flat drawing straight down versus a drawing tipped like this or tipped like this, what happens when you tip it is that there's quite a distortion. Now like the chin looks big and the top of the head looks small. If you do this, the head looks way too skinny. The height is right, but the head is skinny. If you're drawing flat on a drawing table and looking in a mirror, you might have a parallax created for yourself on the paper where you spend a lot of time drawing and then you stand up and you look at the drawing and you're like, holy cow, that's way wider than I thought it was. So be aware of that you really want a direct view of your drawing as you draw and not like drawing onto a tipped surface where you might get that parallax distortion. One of the reasons many painters will work on an easel vertically is to be able to truly see their drawing rather than kind of dealing with that tipped drawing problem, or like a drawing board or drafting table that tips up. It's just easier to see. And sometimes I use my eraser not to get back to white, but just sort of to soften, slightly lighten and blend and soften an area, rather than remove all of the graphite all at once. So what if you need to take a break in your drawing? Like, I'm half done, but I can't work on it again until tomorrow. If that's true, you just have to make sure you can return to the same lighting situation, so don't move your lamps or anything. And make sure that it's the same time of day if you're relying on window lighting. And then just make sure if you've already put in a shirt or whatever you're wearing or your hairstyle, make sure you try to make it as close as possible and find your angle to be the same. I prefer to try and do it all at once, even if I'm sitting there for 3 hours to finish a drawing, or in some cases, doing that sort of college idea of pulling an all-nighter, where I might start after dinner and go until like 4 in the morning if I'm really doing a developed drawing. I haven't done that in a long time, but I used to do that as a college student or before I had kids. But I like that nighttime because no one can bug you. No one's likely to bug you. You're not going to get interrupted by needing to make food for yourself. Well, let's talk about hair. This is something that a lot of people struggle with, and there's nothing worse than having a wonderful drawing ruined by hair that's overly simplified or not thoughtful. So you want to make the hair strokes quick, confident, and I usually start along the edge where it's going to be dark, where I just kind of know it's going to be dark. And when I really look in the mirror, I see that there are some lighter hairs catching highlights, and then some areas where there are no highlights in sight. I can create that effective highlight just by letting some of the paper show through my strokes strategically. And as long as the direction of the strokes is right, those lighter hairs will kind of draw themselves. What you don't want to do is get into the mode where you're like, I know what hair is. I'm going to stop looking at the mirror and just look at my drawing and fill it all in. Because your assumptions are not going to be correct. There's so much going on with shape and value and texture. And I said in the last video, even if you have jet black hair, you're going to have highlight spots on it. And even if you have bleach blonde hair, you're going to have some pretty deep shadows along the edge where the light can't get to it. When I draw, I kind of lose track of time. I have no idea how long this video has gone. I have paused a few times to kind of keep it shorter. I'm just wondering out loud whether I should finish this drawing on camera. Maybe I'll give it another pause and do a whole bunch of work and come back near the finish. It's really important to look for those value variations where you develop darker spots and have lighter highlights within the hair. Yep, I'm going to go ahead and pause it and do some more drawing and be back in a while. And I'm bringing this back. I did quite a bit more work on shading on the different areas of the face, but one thing I want you to notice is what I've done in the background. I didn't leave the page white, I didn't make it jet black, and I didn't do it an even gray. The gray that I used, I sort of layered up slowly where the skin is light or the hair is light. Pushing that gray darker will really make that edge pop. But if you've got a dark section of skin or hair, you don't want dark next to dark where you can't see it. And so what I've done in the background is sort of let this gradually shift towards a lighter gray behind this darker hair. And so you kind of push and pull the background to get the best contrast that you can. If you've got super bright blonde hair up here going really dark is appropriate, so you have a dark background and light hair. But if you have darker hair, you want to go pretty light behind it so you don't compete. Now my ear is pretty bright here on the highlight side, so this is another place where I can probably start to get a little bit deeper with my background gray. And then also the back of my neck and chin, so that will probably kind of match what's going on over here. And we don't want to softly, smoothly blend everything and then scribble the background and make it be a distraction. You really want to take your time so you can be proud of every area of your drawing. I don't want this to be like suddenly going from black to light gray or dark to light gray. I want to kind of make it seem like a natural transition. What I haven't done yet is the shirt collar. which, like I said, you really want to spend the time to get it to look dimensional. Otherwise, people are going to notice that you didn't put the time into that area. And the folds of the fabric are going to cast shadows in interesting ways. There might be seams that you draw where the seam has like a highlight along the edge of the seam and then a shadow along the edge of the seam. And I will probably finish that up off camera. Thank you for watching. I wish you the best of luck on your own self-portrait, and I'm looking forward to seeing it.